Hey everyone, this is the Coaches Impact website. I am Blake Alberts. Joining me today is Dr. Bruce Pietz for the University of Mount Union. Dr. Pietz, can you explain a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I am the Director of Physical Education here at the University of Mount Union. I also head up the coaching minor that we have here on campus.
The reason I brought Dr. Pietz in today is obviously he has some experience with education purposes, whether it's in a classroom or on a sports field, arena, court, whatever you name, could be a place that Dr. Pietz has been familiar with. And specifically what we're talking about today is motivation for a particular athlete or student varies from each person to person. It's hard to try to figure out that fine line of building a relationship with a student and being able to motivate them as well. Can you explain how to really build a trusting relationship with a student or athlete and then start moving towards the motivational standpoint for them?
Well, in any coaching or teaching situation, if there's not trust between the coach, teacher, student, or athlete, I think motivation and success is going to be difficult to attain. So I think to gain that trust with your students, your athletes, should be one of the first priorities that a new coach or a new teacher has. And I think the best way to earn that trust is to be consistent with your athletes, whether that's in your practice planning, your method of discipline, the way you're running your drills, the way you handle each player. And I think the second part that I think a lot of people miss is everybody learns in a different way. Mm-hmm. And how I'm teaching one athlete, I can't necessarily always do that same methodology with a different athlete.
Right.
So it's learning what each athlete has and what best motivates them. Some athletes or students like a little more pressure on them. Others will break under that pressure. So knowing how to motivate from that standpoint, and I think is important. And I've seen a lot of, especially young coaches, not know how to do that well. And I think when that happens is they lose certain athletes. They may lose part of the team because they don't know how to handle each of those athletes. And I think another part that young coaches and teachers could learn is how to optimally challenge your students or your athletes. And I heard this analogy at one time. Think about video games. Level 1 is what? It's usually really easy. I mean, most people playing the game can beat level 1. Then what happens with level 2? It becomes just a little more difficult. And then level 3, 4, and so on and so forth. So when you're planning your practices, when you're planning your drills, always ensure that there's going to be success early, but then you can start optimally challenge your students and athletes so that by the time that practice is over, you've taken them 4 or 5 steps above where they were before. But because they went through steps that were fairly easy to do, they had success in it.
Right.
And if you can manage that type of success, that is very motivating for the students and or athletes.
Not particularly just building that trust relationship with the student, but you have to really, I've heard this so many times, and it's true to even the 3 years that I've been coaching, high school or college, depending on what grade level that you're doing. Is not, respect isn't given, it's earned. Mm-hmm. And how do you really earn that respect for a particular person?
Well, I think, again, it comes to the consistency standpoint, that you're prepared as a coach, that when you go into a practice session, you know what's going to happen, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. But also with that, you're going to need to know how to branch off of that. If something isn't going well, can you as a coach or teacher think on your feet how to change a drill? But players can pick up on that. Your athletes know when you're prepared for practice or not. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for the trust standpoint. But always being there for your student athletes too. I guess being there can have different meanings, but knowing that you're supporting them, that you want the best out of them, regardless if you're the best player or not so much the best player.
Yeah.
That if you hold everybody to the same accountability standards, if you hold everybody to the same expectations that we need to grow as a team, maybe you've been on teams where there's 1 or 2 superstars where they held it to a different standard than the other players, and to me that can have a weird balance on the chemistry of a team where Maybe some players will respect you as a coach where others won't. So I think that's important to handle how you're handling all of your athletes on the team.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I actually was one of the superstars on the team, and I was voted captain amongst my teammates, whether it was football or lacrosse. And what I quickly came to realize from a young age when I was a senior and I tore my ACL, I actually was forced into a situation where I was on the sidelines already, and I knew all this information because I was in between a player and a coach as a captain. I was in that fine line of dancing on the line. And I started to realize more and more, if you show emotion, you care more and more about the sport, and you care about others around you more than yourself, and you're not self-absorbed, you really start getting as much as you possibly can through a student athlete, depending on what the personality is. And specifically when I was a senior, I knew everyone because they were my friends. So I knew how they reacted, how things went in a situation. So I knew I could just communicate with them because I just knew them. So that relationship was already there. So is there a specific way to really reach that relationship standpoint where you just already know a student athlete before you even,
for lack of a better term, predictions, where you can kind of gauge what type of player or what type of mentality each player has. But until you really invest some time into getting to know your players, you can only speculate, and that can be dangerous as well. So it takes a little bit of time, and that's why it's in the world of coaching, you see very fast changes, whether it's at the professional ranks, the college ranks. It's like sometimes it takes time to establish a culture. And if they're quick changes at the top levels of the coaching world, it's just, to me, it's difficult to establish that. That's why you got to give. And I don't know if I'm a big fan of the one and dones, and especially in college basketball. But I mean, think of what Calipari has to do at Kentucky. He has a year, if that, to get to know his players.
How do you really reach their true potential as a player?
And he's got a system, so something's working. Now, is he winning championships all the time? Well, he's competitive, but he's not winning them consistently, so maybe there's something to it. But so for me, it's the time. That's why I think preseason's so important, especially in college football or basketball or any sport, that you have that opportunity to get to know your players, not only from a skill standpoint, but from a personality standpoint too, because I think that's very important in the motivation and getting to know what type of player you have. And I know it's kind of a cliche, but there are so many valuable lessons you can learn in team sports. There's bad lessons you can learn as well, but if a team sport,
but nonetheless, it's a lesson learned.
It is. But when you look at what a team can do for that group, as far as support, opportunity for growth, opportunity to challenge yourself in ways that you haven't been challenged before, and all for the betterment of the team. And I think there are parts of society that are losing that value system, where what can I get out of this? Well, what can we do as a team should be a better avenue for this. So I think if we can kind of come back to what makes up a team, because regardless what profession you're going to go into, you're most likely going to be working with other people. And to me, that's the definition of a team. And if you know how to make the team better, if you can put yourself in that position to make your team better, that's going to make everybody around you, including yourself, more productive.
Throughout these couple years of coaching lacrosse, I've been at school in Alliance, Ohio. My drive, my commute, usually when I go back home to coach a game or a practice during the weekends, is 2.5 hours. So it's really hard to build those relationships with these kids just because of everything that is going on in my life. But granted, for that, I work on my studies from 4 to 6. I end up being on the phone with players from 7 to 11 o'clock, and then I talk to the head coach about how this player's doing, how we can make him better, what are the things that we need to do to implement in his life to make him successful as a player as well as a young man. Being able to reach out to those players, create this bond and build the bridge between them, really makes them respect and value the relationship that you have with them, because they know for a fact that you're pushing everything that you possibly can do for them, and they want to reciprocate it back to you.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point there. Is not only investing in the time, but you could use your time otherwise. right? I'm sure there's 100 different things that you could do during that time, but what are you choosing to do? You're choosing to invest in what you hope is a career, and that's coaching. And your players, whether they say it or not, they value what you're doing.
Yeah.
But another part of that I think is interesting that you brought up, that you've been working with the head coach. And for any future head coach out there, is one thing you need to establish your system as a coaching staff.
Yeah.
Very rarely are you by yourself. So what are you going to use your assistant coaches for? Because you can't do everything. And I think that, so it sounds like your head coach has a system. And it's important to have those assistant coaches that combine to that system that can then supplement what the coaching, what his or her strengths and weaknesses are.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because our head coach is Ross Melgren, Toledo, Ohio, Anthony Wayne Lacrosse, was at a rival school. He didn't have a feeder program, came to our school. Throughout these couple years, he's had a coach on and off, and we really only have 3 people on the staff right now. There's 70 kids.
Okay.
There's a lot to stretch yourself out with, and he's trying to evaluate but also coach his varsity guys up to make us successful, which we're turning that point. But it's very hard when you only have 3 people on your staff. So as me being at school, I'm still the assistant coach. I am the assistant head coach of the lacrosse team, which makes it difficult on him, which I feel obligated to put the much effort in as he does, even though I'm at school. So those times where I'm talking to kids, which a 30-minute phone call here and there to a captain or a player that's having struggles off the field, and I can talk him through that, communicate through that, so they can focus more on just having a release of playing lacrosse and having a good time, more than, man, I'm stressed out, I need to have all these things going on. As well as talking to Ross after all those phone calls, like, Jack is doing this well, Jack needs to work on this, Cooper needs to work on this, all of these things build us better as a coaching staff, because we start to integrate all the things that go into a player as well as what goes on within our team. So if we can work on a player standpoint, then move into a team standpoint, we're even more successful, because we know our strengths and weaknesses at every position. And then right after that, we go into film and usually end up going to bed around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock at night, just because we are wanting to be so invested in all these kids, which makes it hard, just because I'm in school and I have exams, presentations, and all of these. And I'm very fortunate that most of my professors have been flexible enough to let me go home on Thursdays and coach Thursdays through Sundays. So all of these things that I'm investing in, I can start to realize that they're paying off throughout my time at Anthony Wayne, even though I'm 2.5 hours away.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point as well, because you're taking, I mean, look at the life of a student athlete. Whether you're in high school, whether you're in college, whatever level you're at, when you're on the practice field, that's a small slice of what your day is.
Yeah.
And if there's issues coming into that practice, that's going to affect their performance, whether they want to or not. It could affect it in the positive, and it can certainly affect it in the negative. So what you're attempting to do, what sounds like to me, is you're attempting to provide the best avenue for your student athletes to be successful on the field, whether that's practice or matches. And without that balance, things can manifest themselves into really bad things.
Yeah.
Whether it's stress, whether it's issues at home, issues with significant other, whatever it might be, that stress can certainly manifest itself and actually affect performance.
Yeah.
So if you didn't take that time to work with your student athletes on that, that can actually diminish their performance on the field. It's called the Yerkes, dots, and inverted U. We are actually going to cover that in class today, but we didn't have time. Where there's a stress response, where it's an arousal level, and it's a mental arousal. But there's an inverted U, and I'm drawing this on the table for those of you that are listening to us.
Right.
But there's a peak where you have peak mental and physical performance. And if you are not mentally challenged or aroused enough, you can't meet that optimum level of performance. And if you're stressed out, you may go beyond where your performance can actually start being affected because you have too much going on in the mind.